Oh, divine light, a fading memory in this desolate realm. The prison stands complete, forged not merely for the watchers, but as a bulwark for the very stability of creation itself. A cosmic cornerstone against chaos. In the year 2001, the cold, unblinking eye of satellite imagery unveiled an impossibility buried deep within the heart of Antarctica. Structures of immense scale, unsettlingly symmetrical, lay entombed beneath 2 miles of ancient ice older than civilization itself. NASA, with carefully chosen words, attributed them to natural formations. Geologists posited theories of long-dormant volcanic activity, whispers of subterranean eruptions from epochs past. But among the shadows of the internet, conspiracy theorists spoke of alien bases, of extraterrestrial outposts hidden beneath the frozen wasteland. Yet, there exists a third explanation, one lurking within the pages of texts so ancient that most scholars dismiss them as mere mythology, the fanciful imaginings of primitive minds. Today, we delve into the chilling truth to discover why this coldest, most isolated place on Earth might, in reality, be the most important prison in human history. Why fallen angels, beings of immense power and ethereal grace, were not condemned to the purifying flames of hell, but instead cast into the soul-crushing embrace of ice. And why the number 70, representing 70 generations, holds a significance far beyond your wildest imaginings. This is the story of Antarctica's true, hidden purpose, and it begins not with the sterile logic of science, but with a single, devastating sentence spoken before the first stone of the pyramids was ever laid. The command did not arrive as a peal of thunder, for thunder can be escaped, its echoing roar eventually fading into silence. No, this arrived as gravity itself, an invisible, inexorable force pressing down on the very fabric of heaven, bending reality around a single, inescapable decree. Across the second heaven, wings of unimaginable brilliance folded instinctively, as if bowing before an unseen king. Voices, once vibrant with celestial song, fell silent. Even the light itself seemed to dim, as though all of creation leaned forward, holding its breath, desperate to listen. And the Lord said unto Michael, Michael, archangel of justice, felt the words before they were even fully formed. They entered him not as mere sound waves vibrating through the air, but as purpose itself, as duty etched directly into the very architecture of his being. Judgment, not wrath, not blind, unthinking fury, but judgment. Cold, precise, eternal. Michael stood at the very edge of the firmament, gazing downward through the shimmering layers of existence. Below him lay the earth, still young, still wounded, groaning beneath the weight of a violence it had never been created to contain. Behind him stood silence, not the gentle peace of paradise, but the heavy, oppressive silence that follows a guilty verdict. His wings, vast and powerful, unfurled slowly, each feather humming with restrained celestial power. His sword appeared in his grasp, not forged in the fires of some divine smithy, not summoned by incantation, but revealed. It was not mere metal. It was obedience itself, shaped into tangible form. Below him, suspended between the glories of heaven and the despair of exile, stood the Watchers. They no longer stood in disciplined ranks, their once perfect formations now shattered. They huddled together like condemned prisoners awaiting their final judgment. They whispered amongst themselves, their eyes wide with a fear they had never known before. At their center stood Samjaza. Once he had been radiant, a beacon of celestial light. His presence had been steady, commanding, instructional. He had been trusted implicitly. He had been listened to with unwavering respect. He had stood beneath the unblinking gaze of the stars and sworn an oath, a sacred promise meant with every fiber of his being. Now, his magnificent wings were stained with the grime of earth, defiled by his transgressions. His hands trembled, betraying the fear that gnawed at his once unshakable resolve. Michael descended. The very air parted around him, light bending inward as if in deference to the sheer weight of his approach. Michael, Samjaza said, stepping forward, his voice carrying the weight of shared eternity, of a bond now irrevocably broken. "Brother!" Michael did not answer. The command continued, not spoken aloud, but written into the very fabric of reality itself, engraved into the immutable laws that held existence together. "Go to bind Samjaza and his associates, who have united themselves with women. And when their sons have slain one another, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth." The watchers felt the meaning of the words settle over them like a layer of frost forming on bone, chilling them to their very core. 70 generations. Azel's voice broke the oppressive silence, barely more than a desperate whisper. 70? Another cried out, his voice laced with disbelief. "That is longer than kingdoms live." But they did not understand yet. Not truly. 70 generations wasn't just a measure of time. It was a timeline of agony, a countdown to oblivion, a measuring of everything they would miss while the world moved on, forever changed, without them. Michael raised his sword. Heaven itself responded, the very firmament opening, not gently, not violently, but decisively. Support vanished and the watchers fell. At first, they did not cry out. They reached upward, their wings beating reflexively, expecting heaven to catch them, as it always had. It did not. The first scream came from Azel as the very laws of heaven rejected him completely. His wings tore, as if pulled apart by unseen hands, the celestial feathers scattering like dust in the wind. Light peeled away from him layer by layer, exposing what lay beneath, the choices he had made, now made horrifyingly visible. The others followed, their cries multiplied, echoing across dimensions, a symphony of despair. They fell past clouds that recoiled from them, past storms that split apart rather than allow them to touch. The air thickened around them, turning into a tangible resistance that shredded feathers and tore at skin. Samjaza did not scream. He watched the world rise to meet them, white, endless, silent. Antarctica waited, not empty, but prepared. The watchers struck the glacial surface like meteors hurled by a divine hand. Mountains cracked open with sounds like the earth itself crying out in agony. Glaciers split, carving valleys deeper into themselves. Shock waves rippled across the frozen continent, creating fissures that would remain for millennia, a testament to their fall. The cold was immediate, intelligent, purposeful. It invaded their bodies, bit into their very essence, and remembered nothing of mercy. Before the fallen could even rise, the ground moved. Bonds burst forth from beneath the ice, not forged by mortal hands, but spoken into existence, born of divine command. Links of radiant energy erupted from the frozen depths, coiling around limbs, wings, throats. Each touch burned colder than any fire imaginable. Frost spread instantly wherever the restraints tightened, not merely covering them, but fusing with them, becoming an integral part of their new, horrifying reality. Azel shrieked as a binding pierced through his shoulder, pinning him to the ground like an insect to a display board. Another watcher sobbed as his wings were torn backward and locked mid-beat, held in a position of perpetual flight that would never carry him anywhere. Samjaza fell to his knees as divine fetters wrapped around his torso, then drove him face first into the unforgiving glacial surface. Above them, the sky darkened. Michael descended one final time. The aurora bent around him, twisting into shapes that resembled watching eyes, as if all of creation bore witness to this terrible judgment. "This place," Michael said, his voice echoing across the desolate continent, "is the Valley of the Earth." No one answered. They were learning what it meant to have a voice that no longer mattered. "You will remain here until time itself has finished counting you." Samjaza lifted his head, frost already clinging to his beard, crystalline formations growing in his lungs with every breath. "Michael," he said hoarsely, "listen to me." Michael landed before him, and where his feet touched, the glacial surface beneath crystallized into perfect, absolute stillness. "You swore an oath," Samjaza continued, desperation creeping into his voice. "Together we bound ourselves, so that none would fall alone." Michael knelt, bringing his face level with Samjaza's. "And you led them all," he replied quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. Then, the sky tore open, not to release them, but to show them what their freedom had cost. The sky split open like torn flesh. Not light poured through, but images of visions, memories made visible and unavoidable. The watchers cried out as the heavens became mirrors, reflecting their legacy back at them. They saw their sons, the Nephilim, towering, ravenous, beautiful in their terrible strength, monstrous in their insatiable appetites. They watched giants tear cities apart with bare hands, saw rivers run red with blood that should never have been spilled, watched mountains shake under war cries that should never have been voiced. One watcher wailed as he saw his son lift a human child and devour the small body whole, bones crunching between teeth that were never meant to exist. Another shrieked his son's name as rival giants crushed the Nephilim's skull like overripe fruit, brains and bone fragments scattering across a battlefield already thick with corpses. "No!" Azel roared at the sky. "Turn it away! Turn it away!" Michael did not move. His voice was steady, factual, merciless in its honesty. "You will watch." Samjaza saw his own sons standing over a battlefield littered with the dead human and Nephilim alike, the distinction no longer matching in the sea of destruction. Then, they turned on one another, driven mad by a hunger that could never be satisfied, by a pride that recognized no equal. His sons began to fight, brothers against brothers, blood against blood. The first blow landed with the sound of thunder. The second shattered bone like pottery. The third ended a lineage. Samjaza's cry froze in his throat as the glacial cold crept higher up his body, silencing even grief. "This is your teaching," Michael said quietly, not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. "This is what rebellion births." The visions did not fade. They looped. Every scream, every death, every moment of betrayal and violence and corruption played again and again until the sounds became a single, continuous note of anguish. The watchers could not close their eyes. The bonds wouldn't allow it. They were forced to witness every consequence of their choice over and over until watching became a form of existence. When the visions finally dimmed, not ended, just retreated into the background like a nightmare that never fully stops, the silence that followed was worse than the cries had been. The restraints tightened with a sound like bones settling. Arctic cold climbed higher up their bodies, not quickly, but inevitably, like time made visible. Michael rose to his full height, wings spreading wide enough to cast shadows across entire mountain ranges. "For 70 generations, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of divine decree, "you will remain bound in this valley." The number hung in the frozen air. 70 generations. Have you ever tried to imagine what that actually means? Not 70 years, not 70 lifetimes, but 70 complete cycles of human existence. Birth to death to birth again. "You will feel time pass," Michael continued. "You will remember heaven. You will watch the world change without you." He paused. And in that pause, something far below the glacial surface shifted, something ancient and hungry and patient. "And when the last generation ends," Michael said, "you will be led to the abyss." Azel sobbed openly, the sound raw and broken. Samjaza lowered his head, frost already forming in his hair, crystalline structures coating his eyelashes. Michael turned away. The aurora flared once more, brilliant and terrible. Then, it folded back into the sky like a curtain closing on a performance that had ended in tragedy. The valley of the earth went still, and time, vast, patient, merciless time, began its slow work of punishment. But this wasn't just imprisonment. This was a countdown. 70 generations. A generation in biblical terms is roughly 40 years, the time it takes for one complete cycle of human life to give way to the next. 70 generations is 2,800 years. 28 centuries of consciousness, of awareness, of cold that never numbs, frost that never grants the mercy of unconsciousness, bonds that never loosen. Think about that for a moment. The entire span of recorded human history, from ancient Babylon to the Roman Empire to the Middle Ages to today, is only about 3,000 years. These angels would be conscious for nearly all of it. The first generation began far away, beyond the frozen waste, the silence, and the divine restraints. Men lived and died and had children who lived and died in turn. The Watchers felt it, a subtle shift that passed through the bonds like a heartbeat slowing, like a pulse marking time in their very bones. Something unseen, something built into the very structure of their punishment, marked the end of the first generation with a sensation like a nail being driven into their consciousness. Nothing else changed. The glacial surface didn't recede. The fetters didn't loosen. The cold remained absolute, but they knew. They counted. Azel laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed across the white expanse. 1. He whispered to himself, to the ice, to the uncaring sky. Only 1. No one answered him. They were learning that answers didn't matter here. Only counting mattered. The second generation passed. Then the third. With each passing, the visions returned, not of their sons anymore, but of humanity. They saw men and women struggling to rebuild among the ruins left by the Nephilim, saw famine, saw fear, saw primitive prayers whispered into skies that had once been watched over by angels, now empty of that terrible protection. One watcher, Cocobill, who had taught men the constellations, began crying out whenever stars appeared in the visions. "They're wrong," he wailed, his voice breaking with madness creeping in. "The patterns are broken. The heavens are crooked. They are healing." Samjaza said quietly, the words costing him something to speak. "They are forgetting us." Cocobill sobbed, the sound muffled by the frost forming in his throat. By the 10th generation, the cold reached their shoulders. Their wings, those magnificent instruments of flight and glory, were gone, not severed, but absorbed. Frozen feathers had fused with the valley itself, becoming jagged ridges of white crystal that jutted from the glacier like gravestones. They could still feel them. Nerves fired uselessly. Muscles twitched inside solid crystalline structures, trying to move limbs that no longer existed except as memories. One by one, the Watchers stopped struggling. Struggle wasted strength, and strength was needed for something more important than movement. Strength was needed to stay sane, to keep counting, to remain aware enough to endure awareness. By the 30th generation, voices began to fracture. Not physically, the Watchers still spoke, still formed words, but mentally, the coherence that holds consciousness together started coming apart at the edges. Some spoke to things that weren't there. One begged the frozen walls for forgiveness, carrying on conversations as though they might answer, might absolve, might grant mercy that heaven had withheld. Another sang fragments of heaven's hymns, wrong notes, wrong words, melodies remembered through the distortion of 1,200 years of isolation. He sang until the bonds around his throat tightened and crushed the sound away, leaving only frozen silence and the memory of music that would never be sung correctly again. The visions intensified, but now they showed something worse than destruction, replacement. The Watchers watched humanity learning restraint, saw families forming, not the violent couplings they had taught, but covenant relationships built on faithfulness. Watched altars being built, not to forbidden knowledge, but to humble obedience. What does that do to you? Watching the world heal from wounds you caused, knowing you'll never be part of that healing. Samjaza watched a child being born far above the glacial prison. He felt something twist inside him, not physical pain, but something deeper, recognition. This child would matter. This child was part of a plan that continued without them. "Michael," he whispered into the frozen air, his voice carrying no expectation of an answer. "You knew this would happen." The wind did not answer. Only the fetters pulsed once, a reminder that his words were heard by something, even if not by who he wanted. The 42nd generation arrived with a presence. There was no announcement. The aurora simply bent inward, light twisting into familiar patterns. The glacial surface vibrated with a frequency that penetrated to their very bones. Michael stood before them once more, unchanged, untouched by the 1,600 years that had passed above. While the Watchers had deteriorated into frozen monuments of regret, Michael remained exactly as he had been, radiant, purposeful. Azael hurled a curse, his voice cracking with madness and rage, and something that might have been relief at seeing any face other than his fellow prisoners. Others wept, the tears freezing on their cheeks before they could fall. Samjaza lifted his eyes, an act that took effort now, as frost had climbed to his chin. "Is this mercy? Is this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Michael looked at him, and for a moment, something that might have been sorrow crossed his features. "This is containment," Michael said simply. "You could end us," Samjaza continued. "You have the authority, the power. Why don't you?" Michael's gaze moved across the valley, across frozen wings and shattered minds, and immortal regret made visible in crystallized suffering. "Because the sentence was not death," he replied. "It was memory." The bonds pulsed in response to his words, tightening fractionally. "You will remember what you chose," Michael continued, his voice carrying neither satisfaction nor cruelty, only a statement of fact. "You will remember what you lost. You will count every generation of the world continuing without you." He turned away, wings beginning to spread. "And when the last generation ends, you will face what comes next." "Michael," Samjaza called out, desperation finally breaking through. But the angel did not turn back. The aurora straightened, light bending back into its proper patterns. Michael ascended, and as he disappeared into the sky, Samjaza understood something terrible. This had been mercy. The brief moment of being seen, of being acknowledged as still existing, that was the mercy. Michael would not return again. By the 50th generation, most watchers had stopped speaking entirely. Speech requires hope, hope that words might change something, might reach someone, might matter. Hope had frozen solid, buried under 2,000 years of Arctic cold and silence. Only Samjaza remained aware enough to count, disciplined enough by pride, stubbornness, or some last shred of angelic nature to mark each passing generation with internal precision. He watched humanity through the visions that never fully stopped, saw empires rise from the ashes of violence his sons had caused, watched cities built with laws meant to prevent the chaos the Nephilim had unleashed, saw prophets arise, speaking of redemption, of restoration, of a coming deliverance. And then he saw something that made his frozen heart skip a beat. Rain. Not ordinary rain. This was different. This was judgment made liquid, falling in sheets that covered the earth, rising higher and higher until the world he had known vanished beneath the water. The flood. He felt it in the visions, felt humanity drowning, felt the cries, felt the end of an age. But he also felt something else. Righteousness surviving, a family sealed in wood, held above the waters by the same divine hand that had bound him beneath glacial mountains. "Even now," he whispered to himself, to the frozen waste, to the indifferent universe, "we corrupt, even buried for 2,000 years. The consequences of what we did require a flood to cleanse." The frost reached his throat, beginning its final climb toward his mouth, toward silence, absolute. The 70th generation approached. It did not announce itself with trumpets or visions. It arrived as movement deep beneath the valley. Something shifted. The glacial surface cracked, not violently, but deliberately. Thin fractures spread outward like veins, like a body preparing to wake from sleep. Heat whispered upward for the first time in 2,800 years. Azul felt it first and began shrieking. "No!" he croaked, his voice destroyed by time and cold. "No, no, no. This is worse." The bonds loosened slightly, not to free them, but to prepare them. The visions ceased completely. For the first time in 70 generations, the watchers saw nothing but darkness and their own frozen reflections. Samjaza felt fear unlike anything he'd experienced. Not the fear of falling, not the fear of restraints, but the fear of what comes after counting ends. "Azul," he said. Azul did not answer. He was beyond words, unable to process that the waiting was over. Below them, far below, the valley began to open, not outward but downward, toward the abyss that had been waiting beneath Antarctica all along, patient as only hell can be patient, ready to receive what glacial cold had merely held in storage. The sentence was complete. Now the true punishment would begin. The valley didn't explode, parted. A deep grinding sound rolled beneath the surface, like the continent itself inhaling, drawing breath before speech, before final pronouncement. Hairline fractures widened across the glacier. They glowed faintly, at first red, then brighter, like veins of heat pulsing through the frozen white. Steam hissed upward in columns, twisting into the aurora-lit sky. The watchers felt it immediately. Not relief, never relief, but dread. Azel convulsed as warmth touched his frozen skin for the first time in 70 generations. His lips cracked open in a cry that sounded more like a sob, more like a body remembering pain it had forgotten how to process. "No," he whispered, the word coming out in fragments. Cold was mercy. Cold was mercy. The bonds responded. They tightened, not freezing anymore, but burning. Crystalline structures shattered around ancient wrists and ankles, not to free the watchers, but to release them toward what lay beneath. The ground split open. A wound yawned across Antarctica, revealing a descending corridor carved into the very bones of the earth itself. Walls of stone glowed dull red, sweating heat. The air that rose from below tasted of sulfur and scorched breath. The abyss exhaled. Samjaza felt its pull immediately, not physical gravity, but something worse, spiritual inevitability. The restraints moved, pulling them from the glacial surface that had held them for 28 centuries. The watchers were not lifted. They were dragged. Frozen limbs tore free from the ice. Valley floor with sounds like ripping flesh, like roots being torn from ancient soil. Wings, what remained of them shattered completely, dissolving into frost and steam and memory. Azel shrieked as he was pulled headfirst toward the chasm, his fingers clawing uselessly at the melting surface, finding no purchase, finding no mercy. "Michael," he howled into the auroral-lit sky. We remember heaven. We remember." The name echoed once across the frozen continent, then vanished, swallowed by wind and distance and divine silence. No answer came. No angel descended. The time for visitation had passed. One by one, the watchers slid into the opening, fetters rattling like percussion, bodies scraping against stone, heated by something far below. The further they descended, the hotter it became. Frost melted from their forms, exposing raw, hypersensitive flesh that had been preserved in frozen stasis. The cold had kept them intact, held them in a state of perfect preservation. The heat revealed them, showed what they had become, what 70 generations of imprisonment had made them. Samjaza was dragged last as he crossed the threshold where glacial cold ended and heat began. The last of the frozen shell broke away from his body for the first time in countless ages. He felt his full form again and wished desperately that he hadn't. The corridor of descent spiraled downward. Not straight, that would have been too simple, too quick. It spiraled like a drill boring into the earth, like a screw threading into wood. Each turn taking them deeper, hotter, further from any possibility of return. The walls pulsed like muscle. Stone shifted beneath their bodies. The air itself carried sound not loud but constant, as if filled with distant voices, compressed into vibration, into frequency, into noise that was almost below hearing, but never stopped. The bonds guided them unerringly, each watcher being pulled toward a different branch of the abyssal descent. Samjaza watched as Azel's restraints yanked suddenly sideways. "No," Azel cried out, reaching, fingers stretching toward Samjaza in desperate, useless appeal. "Brother!" Their fingers brushed barely. A moment of contact after 70 generations of isolation together. Then Azel was torn away, dragged into a furnace-lit corridor lined with molten iron, his cries echoing and then cutting off as stone sealed behind him. Then another watcher vanished into darkness. Then another into flames. Then another into cold that made Antarctica seem warm by comparison. Because this cold wasn't preservation, it was annihilation stretched across eternity. Soon only Samjaza remained in the main descent. The fetters slowed. The corridor widened into something vast. The abyss ahead didn't brighten. It retreated as if making room, as if something was preparing to receive him personally. This chamber had no floor, only suspended flames. Not fire that consumed, but fire that revealed, that stripped away pretense and pride and every lie he'd told himself across 70 generations. Samjaza hung there, divine bonds wrapped through his limbs, his torso, threading through his very essence like sutures holding a wound open so it could never heal. Flames coiled around him, licking at exposed skin, burning nerves awake that had been frozen for 2,800 years, setting every sensation ablaze, but never destroying the flesh that felt it. Then the abyss spoke, not with sound, with recognition. Samjaza, his name didn't echo. It embedded itself into his being, becoming part of his identity in ways even heaven's naming had never achieved. I know you. The abyss continued, its voice somehow both intimate and vast, personal and universal. Samjaza clenched his jaw, the muscles protesting after millennia of frozen stillness. I know, he whispered. You swore an oath. I did. You bound them so none would turn back. Yes. The flames shifted and within them visions ignited. Not from outside this time, but from within his own memory, perfectly preserved despite his wishes. The oath, the moment he had stood tallest, most convincing, most certain of his righteousness. 200 angels looking to him for leadership, for courage, for permission to do what they secretly wanted but feared to do alone. I wanted us equal, Samjaza whispered, the old justification rising automatically after all this time. I wanted us to share in creation, not just observe it. You wanted control. The abyss interrupted, not cruelly, but factually. The restraints tightened and Samjaza gasped as they threaded deeper. Not through flesh now, but through intention, through memory, through every lie he'd told himself to justify rebellion. The fire showed him his sons again, but not as they had been, as they might have been. He saw them whole, uncorrupted, obedient to the order of creation. Saw them living in harmony with humanity instead of devouring it. Then watched that vision dissolve into the reality. Giants tearing each other apart, consuming everything, corrupting everything, destroying everything. The fire forced him to see both versions simultaneously, what could have been and what was, the potential and the reality, held together in his mind until the weight of it threatened to crack his consciousness entirely. You see, the abyss said, "What you interrupted," Samjaza cried out. The fire inhaled his cry, absorbed it, added it to the eternal sound of the abyss. The punishment was being assigned not randomly, not arbitrarily. The abyss remembered every corruption, every act, every consequence, and it assigned form to each one. Made the punishment fit not just the crime, but the specific personal nature of each fallen angel's choice. Samjaza heard cries from other chambers. Not random, not chaotic, specific. Azal's voice came in waves. Each sound punctuated by metallic clangs that rang like hammer on anvil, like sword on shield, like every weapon he'd taught humanity to forge. The abyss showed Samjaza a vision. Azal hanging spread eagle over a lake of molten iron, weapons rising from the liquid metal, swords, spears, armor, forming and breaking and reforming endlessly in an eternal cycle of creation and destruction. Each clash sent shockwaves through Azal's bones, through his essence, making him feel every wound those weapons would ever cause across all of human history. You taught men war. The fire whispered to him across the distance. Now hear it forever. Feel every blow. Count every death your teaching caused. Kokabel's cries came next. He was trapped inside a rotating sphere of burning constellations. Stars rearranging endlessly, never forming the truth he'd once known. Always creating false patterns, misleading configurations that mocked his corruption of heavenly knowledge. His eyes were forced open by invisible hands, unable to close, unable to look away from the twisted heavens. You taught humans to misread. You bent the heavens. The abyss told him. Now they bend you. Others suffered in deeper silence, their punishments too specific, too personal for outcry, manifesting as slow dissolution of identity. As consciousness turned inside out, as awareness forced to witness its own corruption on eternal repeat. Samjaza was made to hear all of it. Every cry, every sob, Every moment of realization as his brothers, the angels he'd led, the ones who trusted his oath, discovered exactly what eternity meant when measured in suffering. The fire returned its full focus to him. It said with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been simple completion of assigned duty, * will remember. The flames shifted again. They didn't burn his flesh anymore. They burned time itself. Generations began passing through him. Not around him, not above him, but through his consciousness like needles threading fabric. He felt humanity moving forward while he remained fixed, anchored in this moment, in this place, in this eternal recognition of what he'd chosen. He felt righteousness growing in the world above, like a wound he couldn't reach to tear open, like healing he couldn't stop, like redemption spreading across the earth, while he remained locked in the consequence of preventing it. The bonds hummed with a single word, repeated endlessly forever. He tried to pray, old instinct, old habit, old desperate hope that something might hear, might answer, might intervene. The fire answered instead, not with words, with a truth far above, so distant it might as well have been mythology. Michael stood at the boundary of the abyss. He didn't watch the punishments. His task was different. He sealed the abyss. Layer after layer of divine command folded inward. Each one reinforced by obedience, by righteousness, by the same power that had created the universe now focused on one singular task. * lock this away forever. Reality itself stitched shut around the wound in creation, weaving space and time and divine decree into a seal that nothing, not power, not time, not even entropy could break. The final sound before the sealing was complete wasn't outcry. It was inhaling. The abyss drew all sound inward. Every plea, every protest, every echo of rebellion, and compressed it into silence. Then the seal locked, and in the sudden absence of sound, in the completeness of separation, Samjaza understood the final truth. This wasn't punishment as revenge. This was punishment as order restored. Heaven didn't need to destroy them. It only needed to remove them from the equation of creation, to quarantine the corruption so the universe could heal. They had chosen to break alignment with divine order. Now they were perfectly aligned with the consequence of that choice. The abyss settled. Flames slowed, not cooling, but stabilizing into permanence. The fire no longer surged or lashed. It coiled inward, tightening like muscles around bone, locking each watcher into their appointed torment with the precision of divine mathematics. Samjaza felt the shift. The sensation of falling ceased. He was fixed now, not suspended, but embedded in this moment. In this place, in this state, the fire hardened around him without ever solidifying, shaping itself to his outline, becoming the environment he would know forever. He could feel every inch of himself at once. Nerves aflame, memories exposed like raw wounds, thoughts echoing back as accusations that never stopped resonating. The restraints pulsed one final time, then stopped moving. Forever began not with sound, but with the absence of transition. There would be no next phase, no worsening, no relief, only this, only continuation, only awareness stretched across eternity like skin pulled too tight to ever tear. Above the abyss, far beyond reach or hope, the spirits of the Nephilim, unmade, ravenous, lost, were being destroyed, not imprisoned like their fathers, destroyed. A wind moved across the earth, not storm, not breath, but eradication made manifest. The spirits were torn apart completely, their fragments not scattering but vanishing, erased from existence as thoroughly as if they had never been. Samjaza felt each one disappear. Each erasure struck like a hammer blow inside the abyss, like watching his sons die a second time. Final time, permanent time. They are gone, he whispered into the fire. * not punished, not imprisoned, gone. The fire didn't answer. It didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Michael returned once more, not to the abyss itself, but to its boundary. He stood upon the invisible edge, where judgment ended and eternity began, where the seal held reality together against the weight of what it contained. Around him, creation was thick and unmoving, reinforced by decree that would outlast stars. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't speak to those below. Below the seal, beyond reach, Samjaza felt Michael's presence like distant gravity. Faint, unreachable, undeniable. "Michael?" Samjaza called upward. His voice not traveling beyond the fire, but folding inward, returning to him as echo. Michael raised one hand. The seal locked with a finality that resonated through dimensions. No name spoken from below would ever reach above again. No plea, no prayer, no sound. "This prison is complete," Michael said, not to the watchers but to the order of things, to creation itself, to the structure of reality that would now include this sealed wound forevermore. The sentence stands. The abyss accepted the decree. Michael turned away. He would not return. His task was finished. In the eternal fire, Samjaza stopped calling out, not because the pain stopped, because crying out assumed an end. Assumed someone might hear. Assumed change was possible. None of those things were true anymore. "I no longer call out," he whispered to himself, to the fire, to the eternal moment he now inhabited. Calling out assumes an end. Here there is only awareness stretched thin across endless duration. The fire had learned him completely now. Every thought, every memory, every justification and lie and moment of pride that had led him here. It no longer needed to burn fiercely. It burned precisely. Every thought ignited the moment it formed. Every memory sharpened instead of fading, becoming more vivid, more painful, more present with each replay. He remembered the oath again. Always the oath. Wind carrying their voices upward. Stars watching as 200 angels bound themselves in rebellion. Thinking they were brave, thinking they were right. "We thought heaven feared change," Samjaza whispered. "We were wrong. Heaven feared corruption. Heaven feared exactly this." The fire showed him what he'd refused to see. Then obedience hadn't been limitation. It had been alignment with the structure of reality itself. Now he was perfectly aligned too, not with creation, but with consequence. Far above, beyond sealed layers of divine command, beyond frozen mountains and stone and distance unmeasurable, the earth breathed. The flood receded. Life returned. Not perfect, not unscarred, but cleansed. Green broke through mud. Families formed. Altars rose not to forbidden knowledge, but to the God who'd preserved 8 souls through judgment. The plant of righteousness began to grow. Small, fragile, true. Samjaza sensed it faintly, like warmth he could never reach, like hope that existed but not for him. The fire tightened. "Do not look upward," it told him, not cruelly but factually, the way gravity tells you which direction is down. "I must," Samjaza whispered back. Because even here, even now, even forever, he was still created to look toward heaven. That was the deepest cut of all, that the instinct remained. Even when the right to act on it was gone, time lost meaning. Not because it stopped, but because it became uniform. No milestones, no markers, no change to measure against, only continuous being, only awareness, only forever made present tense. The other watchers remained nearby, each locked in personalized torment, each aware of the others without being able to reach them. Their cries had become rhythmic now, predictable, like machinery running on an eternal cycle. Azal still called out, but it was measured, timed, part of the structure of his punishment rather than a reaction to it. Samjaza wondered when his own suffering would become background noise, when consciousness would dull enough to make forever bearable. The thought horrified him more than the fire did. Because if awareness dimmed, if he forgot why he suffered, then the punishment would lose meaning, and meaningless suffering was somehow worse than deserved consequence. The fire granted one final vision, not as punishment this time, as closure, as the last piece of understanding. Samjaza saw the earth far above, ages passing in compressed moments, kingdoms rising and falling like waves, men telling stories of angels, some as warnings, some as myths, most as both. He saw his name written in ancient texts, then watched it being erased, rewritten, forgotten, relegated to footnote and legend and cautionary tale that fewer and fewer people believed. The greatest terror wasn't torment. It was irrelevance. He reached for the vision, trying to hold on to it, trying to maintain some connection to the world that moved on without him. The fire closed around his reaching, absorbed his attempt, added it to the eternal catalogue of his suffering. The seal absolute, permanent, unbreakable. The abyss no longer shifted, no longer responded to anything. It was sealed. Not just physically, but historically, spiritually, completely. Nothing new entered. Nothing escaped. The Watchers were bound together in permanence, exactly as Samjaza had once bound them in oath beneath the stars. The irony was flawless, precise, divine. The fire whispered one final truth, not to punish anymore, but to define, to categorize, to complete the sentence. Asterisk, this is not chaos. This is order restored. Above, the earth moved on. The frozen mountains in Antarctica never forgot what they had held. Scientists would one day find strange formations in satellite images, would wonder, would theorize, would never quite understand why that particular region felt different. The fire never slept. The divine bonds never loosened. The seal never cracked. And somewhere beneath creation itself, beneath glacial surface and stone and layers of reality most humans would never perceive, the Watchers burned not as enemies of God anymore, as lessons, as warnings locked into eternity, as proof that even angels can fall. And that forever means exactly what it says. There is no last cry here. Only the eternal echo of the first one playing on repeat through time that has no end.